Exactly, and you mentioned the auto industry. It's moving out of the places of high taxation, of course, moving out of, well, it's moving into Kalamazoo, it's moving down to Ohio, because it's not high cost and it's not high taxation. And it's kind of scary. We in Michigan need to definitely wake up. But going on what you had mentioned about money is like water, it has to flow somewhere.
Yes.
That really stuck with me, and so I started thinking about, well, the next slide. We've got beakers of water, and it flows from one entity to another, whether it's to employment, to the taxpayers, to government, to the different projects. And I know that this is a very oversimplified way, but it
Sure.
really, I'm hoping that for our residents that it's very impactful.
Well, one of the most important things in education is you start simple and build up to complexity.
Yeah.
So I think you've done a marvelous job with these beakers of water because it shows limitation and flow.
And thank you. So everybody, the first beaker, everybody earns income from somewhere, and the next beaker is the taxpayers. I mean, we all get paid wages, whether it's wages or investments. And the second glass there is actually full because, like you had mentioned, your income is everything that you have to spend. So of course,
Yes.
What you were saying about, whatever you spend, whatever you earn. It doesn't matter if you're government or your household income. But, and then the next one is you do your civic duty and you pay your fair share of taxes. And, like eminent domain, government cannot take away your property without just cause or just compensation. And government, in the same respect, can't give away your money or your tax dollars. But politicians have actually developed legal mechanisms to give away your money. And those legal mechanisms are grants, tax breaks, improvement authorities, bonds, and even contract obligations. Because if they didn't come up with these tax mechanisms, they wouldn't be able to give away our tax dollars.
Now, I think the public should understand that the overall justification for government programs really would be to protect life, limb, and property, and freedom and property. But beyond that, also, I think most politicians have to understand that the justification for their activities is to encourage economic growth, going back to Adam Smith and some of the economists. So one of the questions that has to be asked in any program is, does this encourage economic growth? Does this discourage economic growth? For example, if you were to have a project, whatever project that would be, that overburdens a community in taxation and that discourages investment, well, it's going to discourage economic growth. If, on the other hand, there are various projects that would encourage economic growth, then those projects probably ought to be undertaken. But in each case, they should be taken for the general welfare and not for the specific desires of specific interest groups.
Well, and exactly, and that's what I'm hoping that our residents will see from this presentation, is that a lot of projects, like we have a corridor authority that we're going to be proposing, and people say, well, we've got to bring business in here, we've got to bring business in here, it's for economic growth. But if you look on the screen, the money goes from the government to the projects, but somehow the government has to make up that money that it just gave away.
Yes.
And so in essence, it's really just transferring that money to another entity, but then government ultimately is going to ask for more money either from businesses or from the individual taxpayers.
Yes, and I think what the residents should realize is that your city has committed itself probably to bonding. In other words, you borrowed money. And remember, a bond is a mortgage. When you vote for a bond issue, you're voting to add a second mortgage or a third mortgage on your, or a fourth mortgage on your house. So let's say the city wanted to build tennis courts, or the city wanted to build a swimming pool, and they want to issue bonds. The taxpayer should realize that they're asking you for a second, third, or fourth mortgage. Now, the ability to meet these obligations, be they pension obligations, be they hospitalization obligations, whatever obligations, depends upon the government's ability to collect taxes, which depends upon really the value of houses in St. Clair Shores. If the value of houses goes up, the city here can collect more taxes. If the value drops, obviously it inhibits their ability, their cash flow ability, and that's going to hurt them in being able to pay off these obligations. High taxation can hurt property values. A city not far from here, maybe which we won't mention, has extremely high property taxes. And with extremely high property taxes, it becomes impossible to sell houses, which means the buyer will say, wait a minute, I've got to pay this much taxes. Well, instead of giving you $200,000, I'll give you $150,000. Well, that means that what's going to happen is that the ability of the city to generate cash flows in 10, 20, 30, or 40 years out will be inhibited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it goes back to the previous slide that the residents saw. I mean, the money, money is a limited resource.
Yes.
And it flows from one to another. And if taxation, it just means that it's given to another entity, but you know, government only has two ways of raising revenue. Either tax the business or tax the individual.
Yes, well, local government. The federal government can print money.
Yeah,
I think our governor referred to that. She said, we're different than the federal government. We can't print money.
Which actually turns it into making it worth less.
Making it worth less, which is a tax.
And if we can go back to grants and touch on that a little bit more. There's a gentleman, his name is Matthew Lesko. He's on commercials, and he talks about grants as being free money. Mm-hmm. And he says government has $250 billion, and you can have some too. And he gives this misconception that grants are free money, and people are buying into that. And I wanted to explain by using an example. It's actually similar to something that actually happened, where a school applied for a $100,000 grant, for example, like computer systems or audiovisual equipment, and they applied to the state for it. And you know, everything that happened to it. So using the example on the screen, you know, the taxpayers are doing their civic duty, and they pay the money to the government, and then the government pays the school system, you know, issues that grant dollars. But the problem is, with a grant, if you notice in the government's little glass jar there, they need to find money to fill that up. So the grants really aren't free. That money's been given away. But also with grants, there's a lot of strings attached, where, for example, the computer systems, $100,000 grant, if you don't spend every single dime of it, you lose that money. So you've done your due diligence and you've got the best price, but then you discovered you need to buy 20 more computers, but you don't need them. You can't sell them, or you can't give them away to another school that might need them, because you know that you'd lose your grant. And you can't sell them. You have to buy 20 more computers, and you just put them in a storage closet, because you need to spend every dime of that grant, which is kind of makes it a little bit evil.
It does. Well, I think that the American public should realize that grants are not free, and they're not free from two perspectives. One is that money comes from somewhere. It's coming from taxpayers. So if you're getting a grant, somebody's paying into the Treasury that money to finance that grant. That's number one. Number two is there's a cost to grants because of the strings. And frankly, I think a lot of cities are finding out that the federal or state government will give them a grant, but then the city is obligated to spend a lot of money in order to keep that grant in operation.